Welcome to another War Masters Workshop short. Today we're going to spend a few minutes looking at how you go about patching up either broken Sintra or broken resin. In this case, I'm going to be using a piece of Sintra that I have broken. I've made a pretty jagged break on there. Now, if this was resin, more than likely um, you would have a sort of maybe a spider web break. You might have an eggshell crack. You may have a stress break. There could be all kinds of different breaks. But regardless, what we're going to do here is basically learn how to patch two pieces or one piece that's broken together. And we're going to use some adhesive. And in this case, we're going to use some E6000. I just happen to have some black E6000 that works well with this piece of Sintra. And then after we get this bonded back together, we're going to use some resin. Now, this is a little bit deceptive. This says fiberglass resin. Well, the reality is it's just resin. The fiberglass is here. I got a couple little rectangles of fiberglass that I have cut. So we're going to mix the polyester resin, which is what this is, and we're going to use our chop strand mat here as a reinforcement. And I'll explain exactly what we're doing as we do it. So we're going to go ahead and put our gloves on first. It's always very important that you wear gloves for this because both the adhesive and the resin are toxic chemicals. So we want to make sure that we suit up accordingly. Take care of yourself. It's very important that you don't chance it. Also, make sure when you have your resin that you have your liquid hardener. It's very important. This right here is also something that you want to make sure you're in a well-ventilated area when you use, because it is this is a ketone, and it's very caustic for your lungs. So just please be careful. So let's go ahead and we're going to go ahead and bond these first. Now I'm using E6000. You can use any variety of adhesive. My one piece of advice would be not to use an adhesive that is going to expand. So Gorilla Glue for something like this, probably not something that I would suggest, because what will happen is that glue will expand and then you'll be left with, your piece will be, the glue's going to get all over the piece, plus now you've got to deal with the potential for a size differentiation. Alright, so what I've done was I've just coated one half of that, and I'm just going to put the other half on here. And then I'm going to grab my clamps here, and I'm just going to clamp it closed. Now, if you're using super glue or something like that, you can do this method as well. You can see how the E6000 has filled in that gap there. That's what you want. So we're going to let this cure real quick. Alright, so we've let this dry overnight, the E6000 that we put on our two pieces of Sintra. And as you can see, it is bonded back together. Now, it is a bit flexible there. It's a little weak in this joint area. Plus, it's kind of recessed here on one side. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a small piece of fiberglass, and we're going to strengthen this piece of Sintra that is cracked. So I'm just going to put this on one side for now, and the side I'm going to put it on is the side that has the most amount of depth still in it after we've glued it back together. And normally, if this was on a piece of Sintra or fiberglass resin armor, you would do this on the inside. This portion would happen on the inside of the armor piece, is where you would strengthen that crack by putting fiberglass in it. And then what we're going to do is on the other side, we're going to fill this with some filler to make this nice and flush so that you don't see the crack. Because a lot of times what happens is when, especially with fiberglass, not so much with Sintra, but when fiberglass cracks, a lot of times you get little residual dimples and eggshell cracking. You'll have other, you'll have little pock marks sometimes around the crack. You'll also get where you may have like little parts that have broken out from the crack. So you want to fill that back in so that you not only do you not see that cracked area, but also you're adding strength back to the front as well. So let's go ahead and we'll wet this little piece of fiberglass out, and we'll let it cure so that we can work on the other side. And all I'm using is just some regular, it says fiberglass resin. This is actually polyester resin. So I'm just going to pour a little bit in a plastic cup here, not much. That's plenty. There we go. Don't need a lot of this. And then, of course, our liquid hardener. That's where the smell always, whew, yeah. And we just want a few drops. I'm just going to put 1, 2, 3 drops of hardener. Doesn't take much for such a small amount. Then I'm just going to use my brush here. I'm just going to stir this up. It's actually all in this brush now. Alright, so what I'm doing is I'm just using my brush. All that resin is actually in the brush. Don't need a lot, I'm just squeezing it out of the brush. I'm just tapping it all around here just to wet this out real well. Just like that. You want your fiberglass to be clear. See how that's perfectly clear. It's going to give you that good stinky smell. That's why it's always good to be in a well-ventilated area when you do this. It's okay if you pull it around a little bit. You don't want to manipulate the fiberglass too much, but you do want to make sure that you get the air out of it, any air pockets. And the air pockets always look a little bit lighter, so I'm going to hold it up to the light at an angle. And you're going to see that right down here. See right here how it's got kind of a light look right here? That's a little air bubble. We want to just push that out and make sure we get that nice and out and wetted down. So if you need to pull it a little bit to get that to happen, that's fine. There you go, and it's gone. It's really important that you get those air bubbles out of there, because if you don't, what happens is you leave yourself a void that that's just going to allow future cracks. So anyway, now what we're going to do is we're going to let this cure. Just going to set it on top of this. We're going to let it cure, and then we'll come back, and it should be nice and dried on there and hardened, and we'll we'll check and see how our strength looks after that. And then what we'll do is we'll get a little bit of Bondo or some resin filler. We'll fill this crack right here, and then we will have a piece that is good as new all over again. So yeah, we'll let that dry. We'll be right back. All right, so let's go ahead and look at our Sintra piece here. As you can see, the fiberglass and resin have fully cured. It's actually way more rigid than it was. Remember how this thing bent quite a bit when we had just glued it back together. But we've actually got, especially going outward, a whole lot of tensile strength there. Now going back this way, not so much. But one thing to remember is that when you're doing this in a helmet or on a piece of armor, you're really only going to have a lot of torque happen on one side. And on a helmet, it's actually, the chances of this failing is much less, because you've not only used adhesive, but you've used resin and fiberglass. But a helmet is also, for the most part, one contiguous piece. Now, if you break a whole cheek off, okay, and you have to repair that, then you are better off doing a double-sided fiberglass repair, and then just sanding down, maybe using either a little bit of Bondo or some spot putty, and then sanding that down nice and flush so that you have the fiberglass on both sides, and that'll give you a super hold. But what we're going to do now is we're just going to take some filler. We're going to make some filler, and we're going to fill this crack up, and we'll let that cure, and then that will constitute all of our repair for this specific tutorial. And of course, you want to make sure you use gloves whenever you're using resin. What we're going to use here is just some simple talc powder. All right, so we've stirred our fiberglass bits in there. Now let's go ahead and add our hardener. We're just going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. It's probably 5. I think there was like 5 or 6 actually. That's okay. It's not going to take long for this stuff to kick, so we don't have a lot of time. So let's get this on here. And really, that's about all we need. We don't need a lot. And that's really it. Not a whole lot. So we're going to let this cure. We'll come back to it, and we'll see how that looks and how strong that is. So let's just talk really quick about larger cracks, or cracks that have the potential to reopen, or cracks that may diminish the integrity of an item. So let's say you have a crack that runs along the edge of your helmet where the cheek meets the ear. Okay, so there's right where that cheek indentation meets the ear, there's a nice straight line. What you'd want to do in that case, when you go to repair something like that, where you almost have sort of a joint or two differing angles meeting, if you have a crack in that area, what you want to do is you want to drill a small hole at the end of the crack, so where the crack goes in. Okay, that end of the crack, not all the way at the edge of the crack, like the outer edge. You want to go and drill a hole at the end. And if your crack is, let's say your crack runs along the span of, let me get a bucket here. We'll just look at it real quick. So if your crack, let's say your crack runs like right here, where the cheek right here meets the ear along this joint. If your crack runs here, you're going to want to drill a little hole where the crack ends on the inside, not the edge, but on the inside. You'll drill a hole here, a small hole, and what that does is that inhibits the crack from growing over time. So you'll drill that hole, and then you'll go ahead and you'll do your resin fixing and fiberglass if you need to. So another thing you can do is, let's say you have a crack that runs along here where this joint is. What you'll want to do there is you'll want to drill a hole at the beginning and a hole at the end of the crack. If it's a crack that's inside where there's no edge, drill a hole at the beginning, drill a hole at the end, and then you would do your adhesive and then your resin fix, or you can just go right to the resin fix. And that's how you would deal with cracks that are on, like where two different angles start to come together. And then, of course, it depends on if it's an outer crack or if it's an inner crack, like we just talked about. So anyway, I hope that you've learned something with this month's short. In the next War Masters Workshop episode, we're going to be working on we're going to be doing another short to go over wet sanding, so stay tuned for that one. And then after that, we'll be doing our helmet molding episode 30 of a tried and true War Masters Workshop. So anyway, thanks for joining me, and we'll see you in the workshop.